Good afternoon. So this is Steve Hansen from Wiz Community, and we're going to have a little informal chat with some community leaders from the Chippewa Valley. Today I have with me State Representative Jodi Emerson, State Senator Jeff Smith, and Professor Selika Lawton. Boy, it's been a long day. And we're going to talk about the really odd events of the day. It's been really interesting. We've had a attempted takeover of apparently a fairly successful takeover of the Capitol in Washington, stopping all of the counting for the Electoral College, which was going to go on through the night anyway because of all of the debating about the votes. And now everything is, as far as I last knew, is ground to a halt. So I thought we could all talk about that and what you think about what's going on. Why don't we start with Jodi?
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. Yeah, it's been kind of a crazy last 24 hours, and I think we could probably do this program about so many different topics that have happened, whether it's the Jacob Blake announcement that they're not going to be, prosecuting the officer. We certainly have a lot of stuff going on here in Madison with a session on the floor of the assembly tomorrow, even though they're not allowing us to do any sort of virtual things for the assembly and aren't enforcing a mask mandate. So myself and my colleagues will literally be putting our lives on the line in order to vote on a bill that we are certain is going to get vetoed by the governor. So it's, and then everything happened in DC today. It's just, it's been a very surreal day watching this happen. I can't help but think, as I've been watching the news, that this reminds me an awful lot of how I felt on the morning of September 11th, 2001, as we were watching planes going into buildings in the Pentagon and not knowing what was up in the air and knowing that our country was under attack. We didn't know at that time who was attacking us, but we knew we were under attack. And I have that same feeling today that our country, our democracy, our republic, the very things that everything America stands for is under attack right now. To see these, you can't even call them protesters. It's, rioters. I don't, people who are attempting a coup in the Capitol, taking over the Senate chamber, taking over the House chamber, attempting to steal the Electoral College ballots and things like that. It's absolutely unheard of. So, I mean, I'm really anxious to dig into this with the other guests today because I think there's so much to talk about. Yeah.
Selika, why don't you chime in? Oop, you are muted, it looks like.
Sorry about that. This is the first time the Capitol has been breached since 1814. Since the 1812 war. This is the first time we've had attackers in a federal building in this way since 1814. Now, on one hand, that sounds awful, but on the other hand, I think what's happening today is going to remind us that we have forgotten the lessons of Ole Miss. We have forgotten the lessons from the integration of University of Alabama and from the ending of Jim Crow in southern states. And that's the lessons of enforcement, and that's the lessons of equal treatment. They had 4 kill zones already set up. They did not enforce them. To be honest, they should have been using the projectiles the minute they went through the first kill zone. So the Capitol Police, if you are looking on Twitter, there's a number of pictures where they're taking selfies with some of the invaders, appear to have been infiltrated by these invaders, which is it's a very classic tactic of the Ku Klux Klan. You saw it in Reconstruction. You saw it in the 20s. You saw it in the 1960s. They tried to infiltrate local police forces. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that that stopped as soon as the Montgomery County forces came into the capital. I've lived in DC. I lived in Virginia, in Alexandria, and in Fairfax when I did. Those officers are very well trained and they don't play. So right now, the reports are that the Senate floor has been cleared. They are clearing people with tear gas from outside of the building, and they're working to clear the House floor. But the question for military historians like me is, why didn't they use that tear gas about 2 p.m.? How were they allowed to breach that fence when they had snipers up on the roof of the Capitol? And the pictures of the snipers are available on Twitter. If, it's the question everyone's asking on Twitter and in Facebook. If these had been Black Lives Matter protesters, we would have seen violence a lot sooner. Why were the police waiting until the National Guard came out and the reinforcements came out? And I think we've got to talk about that.
Yeah, it's certainly a question I've had all afternoon. It just seemed like there was pretty much no resistance there at all, and I find that bewildering.
It looks very much like Ole Miss, where the marshals were told not to shoot back at the protesters for James Meredith. If you've seen that footage, it looks scarily similar. It looks scarily similar to the riots we saw at University of Alabama over Arthurine Lucy, and it looks very similar to what we saw with the children's marches, where the local police did not try to protect the protesters. What's different here is this is lawmakers, and that's what has to be talked about. It's one thing, and I'm not saying that I approve of this, but it's one thing to not protect protesters. The refusal to protect our politicians is so far over the line that it's going to have to be investigated.
Okay, and Jeff, do you have something as an opening here?
Yeah, I was going to bring this up too, Selika. What you're talking about is absolutely right, and all I really want to start with is remember just a few months ago, peaceful protesters marching around on the street, not even on the grounds, and they were attacked by the Capitol Police and gassed, so that president could walk to next door to the church to hold up a Bible upside down and backwards, by the way, to get a photo op. It is such a dramatic picture to when you put them side by side, or video, when you put them side by side, you really do have to question what's going on here. And there's no question there's racism, there's bias, there's political gamemanship, and there's definitely a sellout today by this force that did not provide the protection they're supposed to give. Now, I did hear one congressperson, actually it was a former U.S. senator, who just before we got on, being interviewed, and she suggested, well, they are used to, all they have to do is protect the grounds from peaceful tourists and from guests that we bring into the Capitol, and they're just not prepared for this sort of thing. Well, even if that's the case, then we need to re-examine what we have for protection in Washington, D.C., of all places. And it's funny you bring that up, Selika, about I was thinking the same thing, and I'm not a historian, you are, but the War of 1812 came to mind as the last time that our capital was taken over by a not terrorist, but by an opposing force. And it's this is just so surreal. One of my staff people, I told my staff to stay away from our capital now the rest of this week, because there are people circling the state capitol as well. And she had said, she was really just astonished. And I said, well, we got a reality star in office, and we are now all experiencing what the movie, see in real life. And that's what happens when this whole country has turned into a reality show. One more thing I want to add about all of this election stuff that most people are not talking about, and I think start to understand what's going on with the Republican Party as well, and why they have gotten it. It's out of control, and I think that they never really expected to get out of control. Most of them, they just thought they'd play along, and the reason they were playing along this long is because the fact is they want to pass more legislation to suppress the vote, to protect their own power, and they're going to use all that's happening and all of the things that that Trump has been saying as excuses to do just that. And we're already seeing it here in the state of Wisconsin in some rhetoric that we're getting from our Republicans in the elections committees. So stay tuned. This is just the start, I think, of some things we need to be very much aware of is coming down the pipe.
Our country is being asked to make a decision. This is a decision point. And several of you have heard me say this all year. In 1968, we had to make a decision on whether we would indulge Jim Crow or whether we were going to integrate, because communism and fighting communism and being one nation was more important to us. And we chose to integrate and to fight communism. Today, we have to make a decision. Are we going to allow supremacists who want a particular ethno-nation to use violence to attack our democracy? Are we going to take the final steps to equality to keep this nation strong? We cannot serve supremacy, white supremacy or Christian nationalism, and serve democracy at the same time. We're either going to be a nation of states and peoples, or these people will use violence to create a dictatorship in the way the South was for almost 100 years. And that is really it's on loyal, patriotic Republicans who have to decide to put nation over culture and over party. It really is. We cannot afford to indulge this kind of insurrection. I mean, I want to use the right term. We cannot allow the President of the United States to incite a riot, which is what he did at 11 a.m. He literally incited a riot. And he should be in jail because no one is above the law, including the president.
I think that's a really good point, Selika, is to see what's going to happen after this and how we're going to investigate things, how things are going to play out in our judicial system because of it. Trump tweeted a couple of times today, and then he had this video comment, and I was watching one of the main news channels, and they said, so did he pour water or did he pour gas on what's happening at the Capitol right now? And everybody felt like his video message was pouring gas on everything. And I think that's exactly right. A true patriot, a true person who's going to stand by the oath of office that they took, because we take an oath of office. We don't take an oath of party. We don't take an oath of self. is to defend the Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic. And what we saw today, what we are seeing in our Capitol today, is a bunch of domestic terrorists. I had put on Facebook something about, this reminds me of our Capitol is under more danger right now than it was on September 11th from Flight 93. And somebody had questioned whether the people who are at the Capitol right now, invading the Capitol, do they feel like they're the ones flying the plane, or do they feel like they're the ones trying to take down the plane? And I think that's an interesting piece as well. So, Steve, I interrupted you. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. I was going to say, I thought Trump's video statement today was just so typical. Clearly, somebody told him he had to tell people to go home, and he did, sneak that in as a little part of the statement, but mostly it was still more carping about the election having been stolen and how everybody has to fight with him. And I was amazed today to see how heavily he attacked the vice president for being disloyal and not putting him into office as the president again. It's all about loyalty and clannishness and nothing about rule of law or the Constitution. It's just Trump. I see we've lost Jeff. I'll see if he comes back in. Rural broadband in Wisconsin is always challenging, as Jodi, apparently because you're just coming in audio.
Yeah, I apologize for not being able to have video up, but I'm in Madison. I'm in my apartment because there is a small group around the Capitol. So I have left my office. I'm in my apartment, and this is just a place that I use to pretty much sleep. So I don't have any Wi-Fi connection here. So I'm just going off of my cell phone data. So I figure audio is best if there's no video involved. So, and there's our lovely senator right there. So
Jeff is back. I should say at this point.
In Madison.
Should say at this point that even though there aren't a gajillion people watching the live stream, those of you who are, if you leave a comment on the Facebook stream or the YouTube stream or have a question, put them in and we'll talk about it. So any other thoughts here?
Steve, I missed everything that you just said there. It was bad audio on my end. I apologize.
Oh, I just said that if anybody had comments or questions, they can leave them on the YouTube chat or on the Facebook Live comments, and they show up here, so we can talk about them.
There's a lot of lesson. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know what I missed, but I had mentioned before we came on the air about the interview I heard on NPR on my way home today, where the reporter said she talked to someone who said, we need to march all of them out here onto the yard and execute them in groups of 4. It's one thing that you have people chanting. It's another thing that they actually use that sort of language, which right there I would consider to be a felony just with that threat. And we're not seeing, at least yet, those sorts of arrests or takedowns yet.
I think we're going to have to get serious about people making threats. We're going to have to get serious about people thinking that they have the right to use violence. Especially, we're going to have to get serious about people making threats against politicians. The people who were going into the Capitol, they were armed. And we have to have a discussion about allowing people to open carry guns at protests. Now, they weren't allowed to do that with this protest. They had to smuggle those weapons in. But there are some things you do to deter that kind of thing. And you especially have to make sure that people understand you're going to enforce the law against threatening people. If people think they can threaten politicians, they think that they can corrupt the government. They can control the government. That's when you get the kind of assassination environment that you have in Mexico, where the drug dealers assassinate politicians all the time. And in Brazil, we can't allow that to happen here. You have to feel safe in order to be able to represent people in a democracy. And I think it's really important that these John Birchers, we are in the third Red Scare. We had a Red Scare in the 1920s. We had the Red Scare, the McCarthyism in the 1950s. Today is the third Red Scare. And it's really important that bipartisanly, Republican and Democrat, we stand up to these people who want to intimidate both parties into doing what they want. Because that gallows wasn't just there for the Democrats. They were going to go after Republicans too.
Well, and it's really disturbing to see the horrible emails that our offices have gotten. I know Jeff's gotten some of the same ones that I have. It's, the amount of emails in the last 2 months that we've had to send into Capitol Police because of innuendos and threats and just outright saying, if the ballot didn't work, these bullets are going to, and things like that. It was just incredible. And then you mix it in with the fact that they are thinking that we in Wisconsin can control something that's happening at the federal level. We have no control over a federal election. And it's very scary to see the thousands of emails that we've gotten from around the country that are threatening, that are dangerous. And the amount of bullying that we have in this country right now is very scary and very sad. And, I hope that once our administration turns over, we are able to come together as a country. I think certainly the results that happened in Georgia last night are going to add to that. We will now have democratically controlled Congress. We'll have a House, a Senate, and a White House. And this is what divisive rhetoric, divisive behavior leads to is, are we seeing the fall of the Republican Party or the breaking apart of the Republican Party? There's so many strong Republicans that I've talked to that have said, I can't do it anymore. This is not the party that I once belonged to. I don't know where they go from there, but they're going to have, some really big come to Jesus moments and figure out what's going on with their party and what they stand for. So I see we lost Jeff again.
Oops.
Yeah.
We really need to fix this broadband thing in the rural areas, don't we?
Every time I do one of these calls, I'm reminded of that, believe me.
90% of what we're seeing comes back to segregation. And usually when we talk about segregation, we think about urban areas. Mm-hmm. But whites in rural areas also are affected by segregation and are made anxious and are more likely to stereotype. These are the people with the lowest of the low tipping points. They're afraid their culture is going to be taken. They're afraid of anybody who is not white like them. And I want to say it that way because there are white people that they will go after too. They think that they are the chosen people. And if you're white and gay, or if you're white and liberal, or if you're white and ethnic, they don't want you too. So the rural areas that are so segregated are showing out. And what we need is broadband. Because with broadband, people will be able to move into those areas. People will be able to work. Those small towns will be able to live. Because right now, let's be honest, they're dying.
Right.
But that will bring more people with different mindsets, and it will pop their bubbles and lower their anxiety about what other looks like.
Well,
and that's what has to happen.
Yeah. I think of some of these emails that I've gotten either from constituents or from people around the state or around the country talking about there's no way Trump lost this state because I don't know anybody who voted for Biden. Well, like, it just makes me want to laugh because, you know, I'm a fairly liberal person. I have a fairly liberal group of friends, but I know people who voted for Trump. And you have to ask yourself, if you don't know anybody who is voting for another candidate, you have to look internally and wonder, what am I doing to segregate myself off from other viewpoints, other people? Or am I being so divisive that people who are voting for those other people are afraid to say something to me? And so, you know, we really have to have a healing process that needs to happen in our country. And I think each and every one of us needs to look internally and see, what are we doing to further the divide in our country? What are we doing to do away with the divide? And then what are we doing systemically to further or do away with divides? How are we bringing more people to the table? How are we working across the aisle, one way or the other, to do this? Because you know, so many of us were raised, we don't talk religion, we don't talk politics. Well, look at what that has done to us now. We need to get to a point where we can talk about religion and politics in a helpful way. It can't always be fighting about it, because then the only time we have the discussions is when, you know, there's a person walking down the halls of Congress holding a Confederate flag. When I saw that picture on Twitter today, I just thought, you know, not even in the 1860s was there a Confederate flag in that building. And now in 2021, this is what we are seeing. And I think our entire country has to almost go through, well, not our entire country, but a portion of our country has to go through a deprogramming. I know people who have studied cults, and I think there's some very strong similarities between how people who are involved in cults and how people who have bought into the Trumpism, how they are, that, you know, you can't question things, and I think a lot of these people are going to have to be deprogrammed in order to move forward. So,
But see, I grew up with this in Louisiana. And supremacists in Louisiana were like this. You could not question it because they had created a circular logic where they were in power because they thought God put them in power and they were the chosen people. So if you weren't in power, it was because God had not chosen you, God had not favored you. And if you question them being in that means you're evil. You
couldn't
know,
have
and I mean,
anything to do with voter suppression or anything like that in those areas.
well, that's why they thought they could do voter suppression, because they think that this is the right way things should be. And, you know, I grew up with this. It was my generation in the South who had to integrate those schools and had to deal with their kids. They're not brainwashed. They're more like fish in water. They've been surrounded by these ideas for so many years with nothing breaking through. It's kind of like, how do you tell a fish they're in water? You know, you have people who think air does not exist. They also think the earth is flat. I mean, it's so ingrained in them, culturally ingrained, that it's going to be hard. What we need to do, we need new civics education. We need history education. We need to stop indulging them in their mythologies, because we've indulged them in the mythologies that the South will rise again and that this and that and the other. We need broadband in rural areas. We need more people who are new in rural areas, because rural areas have become too segregated. And it's not all rural people. There are plenty of rural people who understand this, especially if they have biracial people in their families. But when you get into those little all-white areas where they are surrounded by a culture that says, and it's not just white, it's only one kind of religion, it's only one sect, and everybody else is going to hell.
Hmm.
And they think they have the right to impose this on everyone else. It's something that the historian Chaffee calls the small town ideal, arguing that small town white specific Christians are the only ones who have the right to have direction in the US. And it's been used to fight the ideal of one person, one vote, really since 1865. We have to fight that. And we need integration more than ever. Nothing is going to fight it more than people having to be thrust in with people who don't look like them, but who are the same class. And that will constantly challenge their stereotypes.
You know, one of the things that I've worked hard on over the last 2 years is to be able to make sure that people who are formerly incarcerated, you know, get the right to vote. That's been one of the things that I've worked on. And I can't help but look at this huge crowd out in DC and think, do they realize that if they're charged with a felony, and depending on which felony they're charged with, they might lose their right to vote forever, depending on what state they're in? And that makes me, you know, wonder about how we're going to handle voting rights for felons and things like that as we go forward. If all of a sudden there's 20,000 people that have felony charges on them from today, is this going to make the other party think differently about felony voting records? So
They don't expect to be charged.
I'm sure they don't, but what they need to remember is that in a couple weeks, we're going to have a different administration with a different attorney general and a whole different system in place. And it'll be interesting to see how things come out. So
That's a really painful issue. I was just in on a discussion a couple weeks ago because it's one of the new policy statements that is being brought up at the Farmers Union Convention. And even among a bunch of people who were, you know, nominally fairly liberal, we couldn't agree on how to word that, since I and a couple other people were really on the side of, why can't you vote if you're in prison and you're a felon, you're still a citizen? And that didn't go over real well with some of the people in the
well,
talk. They thought it was a bridge too far, you know, and I think you ask for what you want, not what you think you're going to get.
yeah.
Well, part of it, though, is what do we use that idea of criminal to do? And we use it to justify taking away voting rights. We use it to justify taking away all sorts of stuff. I'm a practicing Catholic, and we're pushing our bishops for the first time to in 20 years to talk about that seamless code of life, to talk about that the ex-incarcerated and the incarcerated's lives are as important as the preborn. And there are people having a cow. But I think it's time to push that Overton window back to the center. It has been pushed too far to the idea that if you have a felony conviction, you are an inhuman monster. And that came out of that 1994 crime bill. That's a bipartisan sin, but we have to have that discussion. I mean, I think Jodi's right that a bunch of these people are going to get felonies. And now that white people are getting felonies, we're having a discussion about the overregulation of American life. This should further that.
Yeah.
I have a map up from Census Scope, which is the US Census, and it's showing me where the African American population is as opposed to other races. One of the interesting ideas for the future, people are already talking about what happened in Georgia being done in Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama have more Black people there than Georgia. And Louisiana just re-enfranchised ex-incarcerated.
Yeah.
What is that going to mean going forward? I want two parties. I mean, I'm voting Democrat, right? You know, I'm voting Democrat, but I want two parties. because one party rule is the way we get corruption.
Well, to be honest, Selika, I wouldn't mind 3 or 4 parties. I think it'd be a lot easier to not have a singular control of power and actually have people supported a lot more with their ideas. So I'll even go a step further than you. So,
Well, if Texas and Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama go purple,
Mhm.
people will have to start competing on ideas instead of this tribalism that I'm a Republican is like I'm a Packers fan. This is my identity. I'm a Democrat is like I'm a Saints fan. This is my identity.
There's nothing wrong
And
with Packer fans, though. So,
there is nothing wrong with Packer fan or Saints fan. I am a Saints fan. I'm in a mixed marriage. I'm a Saints fan married to a 49er with 2 Packer kids in the house because they're from Wisconsin.
I was going to ask how you're going to raise the kids because that's always.
We had no choice. They're Packers. It's a mixed house, but we need to drop the contempt. I think the partisan contempt is what has been hurting us. We have to stop people with the name calling, stop people with the dehumanizing language, stop people with the threats. And the best way to do that, again, is integration and enforcement. They have to have accountability. I worry about Jodi's safety. I worry about Jim's safety. I'm worrying about Ron Kind's safety right now. I know he's heroically, he texted me that he's helping to protect the Capitol, and that's really great, but that's not supposed to be his job. They're supposed to be protecting him.
Mhm.
You know, I think that education has a lot to do. My field has fallen down. We have fallen down on the job. I'm going to say that. And I'm pointing that finger at me and at everyone else who has taken history out of schools, who no longer mandates it at the university level. I'm pointing at No Child Left Behind. All of us had civics in high school taught by a teacher. That, unless you're taking AP, that doesn't happen these days. That's how they get brainwashed.
Whether we called it civics or not, we got taught it. You know, I was in the social studies period, and my brother was in the civics period. So it changes, but you get taught it.
Social studies ed teachers can be certified today with, I believe, only 3 credits of social studies ed, only 45 credits of history, and only 3 credits of economics. When you think about that, that's inadequate to the task of being able to handle our new disinformation ridden environment. They need more than that. They need, in high school, they need a full semester of government. I would say a full year of government. And they probably need 3 years of history.
Mhm. One of the other things I wanted to ask you guys about and see what you're thinking on this is the idea that some people out in DC were talking about today about these 100 or so congressional delegates who are fighting the Electoral College vote, the 12 senators that are doing it, especially with Congress because they're voted in every 2 years. If they're arguing that these elections were rigged and Trump wasn't voted in, how can they stand by the fact that they won their election? I mean, should they not be accepted into Congress? Are they not committing some sort of act of treason or sedition or something like that? Salik, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, in the Senate, there was a Republican senator who made just that objection yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's an illogical argument. It's a hypocritical argument. You can't say that there's just fraud in the presidential ticket and not down the ticket, which is what they're trying to argue, that there's just fraud in this one ticket. It's illogical if you know how elections work. But these are also, let's be honest, these are the people who have been tweeting a schematic for a Boss distortion pedal and saying that that's what they're injecting us with the COVID vaccine. So these are not people who actually know that much about these processes or know that much about what they're talking about. They're just kind of loud. And I think calling them on to hypocrisy doesn't do any good because they think they're special and think they get to do this. The only thing they understand is enforcement. And that means the Republican Party needs to run some moderates against them in the primaries and put them out.
Well, which is also part of the problem with gerrymandering. And here in Wisconsin, we
Yes.
see that so much. But when you have districts like mine that's drawn as kind of a Democratic district, or a district that is, one of my neighboring districts that's drawn as a Republican district, the only real race that you end up having is in and amongst your own party. And so you end up, if you've got people on a scale of 0 to 100, and 100 is very progressive and 0 is very conservative. If you've got a Republican district, you're going to get somebody who's in the 15 to 35 range, where if it's more of a fairly drawn district, you have to get somebody who's a 45 maybe. And so that also leads to part of the problems that we're seeing, not only nationally, but in our state, with so much gridlock, because the people who are elected end up being a lot more either progressive or conservative. And so it's harder for us then to come together once we are seated in office. And then that's a consequence of gerrymandering when we have districts that are drawn the way that they are. If you have to be more concerned about what everybody is thinking in your district, not just what your party is thinking, you tend to be a little bit more moderate, and that's when we get things done. Now, I always think it's good to have people on the far left or the far right in the mix, because we need to have those opinions said as well. But we're losing that middle ground in both parties, and I see it every single day down here in Madison. So that is one of the things that I hope that we'll be able to change in the coming legislative session, is doing away with some of the gerrymandering that we have. But we see it in the congressional level as well. So.
Well, that's why the ACLU of Wisconsin and ACLU of New Jersey led the lawsuit to try to get the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn gerrymander.
Mm-hmm.
Because racial gerrymander is already illegal, but they refused it and they punted it. So it's going to be up to the voters, and we are going to have to do it. But there's a new generation up, and I think we are beginning to see the demographic change enough that at the state level, if we can get enough representatives to put it on referendum, we will see gerrymander probably removed. Right now, Wisconsin does not have initiative.
Right.
So referendums have to start in the legislature. If we had initiative, I think gerrymander would be gone already.
Right. And we brought up a bill to try and get referendums on the ballot last session, that, if somebody brings up a bill 2 sessions in a row, we can't get it voted on. It would allow a citizen to put it on the ballot for approval or disapproval. And we couldn't even get a hearing on that. So, the party of power right now wants to stay the party of power, even though, as we've seen, not only in the 2020 election, but in the 2018 elections statewide, we're more of a blue state, barely blue, but we are a blue state. And so, but it's interesting that both our legislative chambers in Madison are very much in control of the Republican Party. So that's how lines do it. So,
well, we need to get to purple.
Yeah.
It can all be a little schizophrenic. I have very firmly Republican assembly seat here and a very firmly Democratic Senate seat. So I get one of each. It's confusing because I know because I know it really doesn't matter how I vote in those offices because it's a done deal.
Yep.
Well, see, you realize that where I was in Louisiana until 1980, you had one boll weevil Democrat and another boll weevil Democrat who would be a Republican today. And that's all you could vote for. So the situation we have here today in Wisconsin is the situation I grew up with in Louisiana. And it breeds corruption. It breeds discrimination. I think the people who want to say that there's no racism today, the people who want to say that there's no discrimination, that everybody's equal, are being willfully ignorant, but they're also ignoring the idea that corruption hurts white people as well. And that's why on Conversations in Color, we had that one episode about how racism and corruption hurts white people. And it means you get a situation where we have right now where you don't get choices. You really don't get choices. And thoughtful people have to start coming together. And we're going to have some panels at Jodi, I'll be talking to you about the Martin Luther King program.
Sounds good. I was wondering when that was coming.
It's coming, and I have a panel on the First Amendment and race I'm thinking about that I really would like probably for you to be a part of.
Wonderful.
Because we have to start knitting this fabric back together.
Yep.
And
so much I would love to hear when people are talking about racism or discrimination, being somebody who was born and raised in Eau Claire as a white person, you have to force yourself to look for it. And so to be able to say, gosh, systemic racism doesn't necessarily impact me, but I'm sure it impacts you. Can you tell me your experience with it? And then to be able to have an open conversation about that. We need to get to that point where all of us can say, okay, just because it doesn't impact me in my personal life, whatever that situation is, doesn't mean that it doesn't impact somebody. And that's what is so dismissive about so many people, I think. If it doesn't impact them, it doesn't exist. And you have to open your eyes and say, okay, it does happen. I'm not impacted directly by it. I might be impacted indirectly by it, but other people are impacted by it. So how can you tell me your experience? And being able to have those open conversations, it would help if we could get rid of the pandemic where we could actually, sit down and break bread with one another and be able to actually physically come together too. We'll get there, the vaccine's out, but it's baby steps with that. And so, yeah.
Boy, I really miss having these panels with people, in the same room. Things like this just always feel really forced and artificial to me. And I even have, fiber to my farmhouse, so it's technically easy for me. But I'd really like to be in the same room with you guys.
Well, I know if we were in the same room, we'd probably talk for hours and hours and hours. So
we'd have to cut off eventually, yeah.
Steve, I'm so glad that you organized this panel today. I'm so happy that you gave us an opportunity to talk about this really dark day in our nation. I hope that we can come out of this stronger. America has always done that. We've always banded together. I just don't know what kind of America we're going to have tomorrow and the day after and, February 1st and March 1st. But I don't think either Selika or I or Jeff, who's had to get off the phone now, would do what we do if we didn't love our country. And that's why we're willing to fight for the country that we have a vision for.
I think part of the reason I wanted to do this is all of a sudden this afternoon, America felt palpably different to me than it did when I got up this morning. And I'm worried that that's going to continue in ways I can't even imagine.
There's only a handful of days that we get to say that this was a history-changing moment or a life-changing moment or country-changing moment, and today was one of them.
This is a decision point in history, and I think we it is weird to be a historian and you're watching the history unfold in front of you. And my policymaker hat, my Rand hat comes back, and it makes me think that we're going to go through another 1970s. There's going to be dislocation, and we're going to have to feel our way to what our new society is going to look like. We're going to have to we're going to be changing some laws. That's clear. We may be amending the Constitution so that presidents have to do their tax returns and that a president who incites violence can be arrested and removed immediately. So it's clear there's going to be something that's going to be happening. But today I'm hopeful because it feels like a whole bunch of people just finally got shaken out of their complacency. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yes.
It does. And I have to say that, over this last hour, I feel more hopeful about our country just being able to talk to you folks about this. So thank you so much, Steve, for bringing us all together on this. I appreciate it.
There are
Let's
some
just
other
call it a
people
therapy session.
there are some other people I thought about inviting who might have made you feel differently, but I'm sure they would have said no, especially on such short notice. I want to thank you both and Jeff for coming in here on like an hour's notice or less. I didn't think I'd get anybody, but it worked out fine. So we're coming up on the end of an hour here, and it feels like a logical place to stop. I think we should do this again and maybe break it up with some other people. And that's been my plan for a while, but all of a sudden today it popped to the top of my agenda. I do want to say, those of you who are really interested in education, there's a state superintendent forum at 7 o'clock tonight, which you can sign up to see. And I'm going to try to hijack the stream onto Wis Community off of Wisconsin Eye. So I hope you can watch it here as well. Selika, you should plug Conversations in Color because I think more people should know about it.
Monday nights, 7:30, we are talking about the issues that are critical and that are hard to discuss. And we want to talk about them in a way where everybody's respected and everybody gets heard. So Monday nights, either on Facebook Live on the Conversations in Color page, on 101.9 Converge is back, or on the Paragon app on Facebook. And you can, if you need a link or you need a YouTube, and we do record them and put them on YouTube, you can email me at duckswsm@uwec.edu. Adam, Ed, Rod, and I would love to see you there. And Steve, we'll come looking for you. We've had Jodi on. We get a good time.
You should also be in the Wis Community calendar. I'm pretty sure this one's in there. I'll check after we're done to make sure. I try to get them in every week.
And we are going to do Martin Luther King. It's starting at 9 o'clock with Terry Weld, who will be talking about the Transformation Project and kicking it off. We're going to have a day-long program that involves speakers and live panels, and the kids are back reading Martin Luther King speeches and the ABCs of racism. And it's going to end with a free concert on the Paragon app from the Pablo Center.
Wonderful.
Okay,
So,
Jodi, any last thing you want to kick in here?
I really appreciate you doing this panel. Today, as I was looking at all the pictures on Twitter and Facebook and seeing how journalists were putting themselves out there to cover this critical day in our nation's history. You know, you guys know I'm married to a journalist, so I'm a little bit biased with this, but I really do, you know, I do think that we have to stop and thank our media. And that's come under assault in the last few years. And to think that there were people who, you know, were out there taking pictures and getting in the way and getting in the middle to get the story, that if it wasn't for journalists, we wouldn't know what was going on in our nation's capital right now. If it wasn't for people being there and inserting themselves into the Senate chamber to get the photos, we wouldn't have those. And so, you know, they really are the fourth pillar of our democracy. And we do need to appreciate that. And so I just wanted to say, Steve, I appreciate you for doing what you do to keep journalism out there in our rural communities and in West Central Wisconsin and the Chippewa Valley. So thank you.
Thank you, definitely.
And thanks to your husband as well. I found it interesting. I was moderating a Twitter feed all day pretty much until we started with this, and I thought it was interesting that there were a lot of politicians out there, you know, live streaming out of the Capitol. I had Mark Pocan, Cub reporter, going on there for a while. It's been a really interesting day and something I hope I don't see again soon. But I have a feeling I will.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe not as bad as this, because Ole Miss was a turning point where they got very serious about violence. I think if they don't with this, there will be one more, but we're not going to tolerate too much more. I think people are just not going to tolerate this. It's we can't.
I thought it was interesting how many Republicans today in there were just as appalled as anybody else. Sometimes you want to say, well, you know, you've been feeding it for months and now you're appalled. But I mean, certainly not everybody, but there are people who, you know, that's a fair criticism, I think.
I just want them to get their stuff together and come back to the side of goodness and light and stop feeding this monster. They gotta stop. They can't have this Faustian bargain anymore. They just can't.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. So good to see you both. Take care of yourselves and stay well, okay?
Okay, thank you. We're going to end here. Selika, if you could hang on for just a minute.
Okay.
I want to chat with you about something.
Take care,
All righty,
guys.
I'm right here.